3 days ago, I sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Greenville, South Carolina, read one single piece of paper, and laughed so hard, the kind of laughing you can't stop, the kind that makes tears run, that the attorney pushed back his chair, looked at me with genuine concern, and asked, "Mrs. Roy, are you all right?" I told him I was fine. And for the first time in 4 years, I meant it. Now, before I tell you what was on that piece of paper, before I tell you about the phone call I was never supposed to hear, the surgery I went through alone, and the 4 years of silence that followed, I need you to understand something. I am not a bitter woman. I'm not here to tear anyone apart. I'm not here to make anyone look bad. I'm here because what happened to me happens to women every single day. Good women, strong women, women who gave everything to their families and then found themselves standing outside a door that used to have their name on it. And I want those women to know something important. The story is not over when someone pushes you out. Sometimes, the most powerful chapter hasn't even started yet. My name is Twila Roy. I'm 71 years old. I live alone in a little house in Greenville, South Carolina, with a porch that faces east so I can see the sunrise, a garden that feeds me in the summer, and a photograph on my kitchen wall of a man who loved me the right way for 38 years. That man was my husband, Walter Roy. He's been gone for 6 years, and as it turns out, even from wherever he is now, that man was still looking out for me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, back to a Tuesday morning in Dayton, Ohio, in 1975, when I brought a 7-pound, 4-ounce boy into the world and named him Theodore James Roy. And for 40 years after that, that boy was the center of my world. I want to start by telling you what this story is not. This is not a story about a bad son. It is not a story about an evil daughter-in-law. It is not a revenge fantasy or a scoreboard of who is wrong and by how much. Life is rarely that clean. This is a story about what happens when a woman spends decades putting everyone else first and then, finally, painfully, learns what it looks like to put herself first. It is a story about the love that waited quietly in the background while the louder things demanded attention. And it is a story about a piece of paper that arrived 5 years too late to hurt me, because by the time it came, I had already become someone it couldn't touch. I want to tell you about Theodore before everything changed, because he wasn't always the man who sent a lawyer's letter. He was once a boy who fell asleep on my shoulder during car rides, who cried when our dog Biscuit died, who called me from his freshman dorm at Ohio State at 11 o'clock at night just to ask how I was doing. He was once the boy I raised. And somewhere between there and here, something happened. I want to tell you exactly what that was. But first, I need you to understand something about how family erosion works, because people on the outside always ask, why didn't you see it coming? Why didn't you say something earlier? Why did you let it go on so long? And the answer is because it doesn't come at you all at once. It doesn't arrive as a clear statement you can point to and argue against. It comes in layers over years, each layer so thin you barely feel it landing. And by the time you can see the full picture, you're already... Walter and I married in 1971. He was an electrical engineer. I was a registered nurse at Miami Valley Hospital, and I was good at my job. We weren't rich, but we were solid. We owned a 2-bedroom house on Ferndale Drive in Dayton with a backyard that Walter mowed every Saturday like clockwork, a maple tree out front that turned orange in October, and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and whatever I had in the slow cooker. Theodore was born 4 years into our marriage. He was our only child, not by choice, just by the way life worked out. And because of that, maybe because of that, he was everything. Walter coached his little league team for 6 years. I made sure there was a hot meal on the table every night, no matter what shift I'd just come off of. When Theodore struggled in math in the 5th grade, I hired a tutor and paid for it by picking up extra weekend shifts. When he got his first car, a used 1989 Ford Escort that smelled like French fries and old carpet, Walter spent 2 full Saturdays teaching him how to check the oil, change a tire, and jump a dead battery. We were not perfect parents. No one is, but we were present, we were consistent, and we loved that boy with everything we had. Walter died of a heart attack in the spring of 2019. He was 72 years old. He went the way he did most things, quietly, without making a fuss, on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. I found him there, still in his reading glasses. I don't talk about that often, but I need you to understand what Theodore's father was to me and to him so you understand what came after. For the first year after Walter died, Theodore was there. He called every few days. He drove up from Columbus. He'd moved to Columbus 10 years earlier for work and helped me sort through Walter's things. He sat with me at the kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't try to rush me through my grief. That was the Theodore I raised. But Jennifer had been in the picture for 3 years by then, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to shift. Jennifer Hartley, she kept her last name, which is her right, I have no issue with that, was a project manager at a construction firm. Smart woman, organized, the kind of person who color codes her grocery list. I tried to like her, I genuinely tried. In the beginning, she was perfectly pleasant, polite at dinners, asked me about my nursing career, brought wine when she and Theodore visited. But there was always something, a slight edge when I spoke too long, a glance she'd give Theodore when I repeated a story, a way of steering conversations away from anything that centered me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. My closest friend, Doris Campbell, we've been friends since 1983. She was my neighbor on Ferndale Drive for 11 years. Doris saw it before I did. Twyla, she told me about a year after the wedding, that woman is managing you, and I didn't want to believe her, because accepting that would mean accepting that my son was letting it happen. So I kept showing up, every holiday, every birthday, every time Theodore mentioned they were having trouble with something, a plumbing issue, a car repair, help moving furniture to a new house, I was there. With my hands, with my money when they needed it, with my time. I loaned Theodore $8,000 in 2020 to help cover the down payment on their second car. He said he'd pay me back. He never brought it up again, and I never pushed. Because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We tell ourselves it's love, and it is love, but sometimes love teaches the wrong lesson. I was teaching Theodore that I would always be there no matter what he gave back. And he learned it. I want to pause here and say something directly to the women listening who are nodding right now. If you have spent years being the one who shows up, the one who fills the gaps, floats the money, swallows the hurt, and tells yourself that's just what family does, I want you to hear this. That is not love being returned. That is love being taken for granted. And those two things feel identical from the inside. It started with Thanksgiving. The first Thanksgiving after Walter died, Theodore and Jennifer came to me in Dayton. I cooked the whole meal, turkey, sweet potato casserole, green beans with the little pearl onions Walter always loved, 2 pies. The table was set properly. Walter's chair was empty, but I'd put a candle there instead of leaving it bare. Jennifer walked in, looked around the kitchen, and said very casually, setting her purse down, "You know, Theodore and I have been thinking it might be easier to just do holidays at our place from now on. Less travel for you with everything going on. Less travel. Dayton to Columbus is 90 minutes. I smiled and said, that's something to talk about, and we had a lovely dinner. But the next year we were at their house, and the year after that. And suddenly I was a guest in my son's home at the holidays, arriving with a dish I'd been assigned, always the green beans, never anything I chose, sitting where I was pointed, leaving by 8 o'clock because Jennifer had an early morning. I'm not going to go through every incident. You know how this works. You've either lived it yourself or you've watched it happen to someone you love. It's never one big thing. It's 100 small things, each one easy to explain away, adding up over years into something you can't ignore. Let me give you a few of the specifics because I think specifics matter. I think when we keep things vague, it lets other people dismiss the story. So let me be concrete. At Theodore's 44th birthday dinner, they hosted it at their house. Jennifer arranged seating so that I was at the far end of the table from Theodore, between 2 of his work colleagues I had never met. I spent most of the dinner explaining to a man named Craig what I used to do for work. Theodore was at the other end laughing and telling stories I'd never heard. We spoke twice, once when I arrived and once when I left. That is not an accident. That is a choice about who matters in a room. When Theodore and Jennifer remodeled their kitchen in the fall of 2021, I offered to help. I said I could come for a long weekend, help them pack up the old cabinets, be an extra set of hands. Jennifer said they had it covered. The following week, I saw photos on social media, which I only found because a mutual friend had been tagged, of Jennifer's mother, Patricia, and her sister doing exactly what I had offered to do. packing boxes, laughing in the kitchen, looking like family. I did not say anything, because what would I say? What argument could I make that wouldn't sound like complaint? That is how it works. You are slowly made irrelevant, and then, if you object, you are called difficult for noticing it. Jennifer told Theodore I was too needy. He told me this himself, with apology in his voice, in a phone call in 2021. I asked him what that meant. He said I called too much. I called once a week, every Sunday at 2 o'clock, the same time I'd called for 20 years. I went to once every 2 weeks. The calls got shorter. Theodore started sounding distracted, like he was doing something else while we talked. Jennifer told their friends that I was difficult. I found out from Theodore's college friend Marcus, who ran into me at the Kroger in Columbus when I was visiting and said, "Twyla, I've always liked you. Don't pay attention to what people say." I didn't know what people were saying. But I started to piece it together. Jennifer told the couple next door, a nice pair named Greg and Pam who I'd met twice at cookouts, that I had memory problems, that I sometimes got confused. That Theodore was very patient with me. I have never had memory problems. I was a registered nurse for 31 years. I charted medications, calculated dosages, managed care plans for critically ill patients. My mind is sharp. It has always been sharp. But once someone plants that seed, she's losing it. She's confused. She's not quite right. People start seeing it whether it's there or not. They look at you a little differently. They speak a little slower. They exchange glances. I noticed. And then came February of 2022. I had been having chest pains for several months. Not dramatic, not crushing, a tightness, a pressure, the kind a nurse recognizes and takes seriously even when she doesn't want to. I went to my cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Osei, who ordered a stress test, then a scan, then sat me down and said the word I'd been quietly dreading. Surgery, open heart surgery, a valve replacement. Not optional, not something we could manage with medication. Necessary, and the sooner the better. I scheduled it for March 15th. I called Theodore the day I got the diagnosis. He said, "Mom, that's serious." He said, "Let me talk to Jennifer and we'll figure out the schedule." He said he'd call me back. He called back 3 days later and told me he'd try to come, but it was a busy time at work. Jennifer had a project deadline. He said he'd see what he could do. My neighbor in Greenville, I'd moved here in 2021. After the Dayton house got to be too much to manage alone, my neighbor Clarice Boudreau drove me to the hospital at 5 in the morning. Clarice is 74 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Louisiana, and the kind of woman who shows up without being asked. She sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. Theodore did not come. When I woke up in recovery, the first thing I did before the pain really registered, before the anesthesia had fully cleared, was look at the doorway. It was a nurse I didn't know. Theodore called that evening. He said he was sorry he couldn't make it. He said it the way people say it when they know they should feel worse than they do. And I told him it was all right because I was still on pain medication and I didn't have the energy to tell the truth. But it wasn't all right. You don't miss your mother's open heart surgery because of a project deadline. I lay in that hospital bed for 3 days and I thought about a lot of things. I thought about Walter. I thought about the years I'd given. I thought about the Sunday calls that got shorter and shorter. I thought about the Thanksgiving where Jennifer took over my kitchen and quietly, efficiently erased me from my own holiday. I thought about my own mother, Rosalie, who died alone in a nursing home in 1998 because we lived too far and thought there was always more time. And I made myself a promise in that hospital bed. I would not spend whatever years I had left waiting for a door to open that someone had already quietly, efficiently closed. The call I was never supposed to hear happened in April of 2022, 5 weeks after my surgery. I was still recovering, moving slowly, tiring easily. Clarice brought me soup on Tuesdays. Doris drove down from Dayton for a week to stay with me. I was doing well, all things considered. My heart was healing. The rest of me was still deciding. Theodore called on a Saturday afternoon, which was unusual. He typically waited for my Sunday call. When I picked up, I could tell immediately something was off. There was noise in the background, voices, and then I realized he hadn't meant to call me. He'd pocket-dialed me. Or he'd hit my name by accident. I started to say hello, started to let him know I was there. And then I heard his voice, not talking to me, talking to Jennifer. I should have hung up, I know that. If I'd been a different kind of woman, I would have. But I was lying in my recliner with a scar down my chest, and I'd spent 5 weeks waiting for him to call and actually ask how I was doing, and something kept my finger from touching that screen. What I heard in the next 40 seconds changed everything. Jennifer was asking about a credit card bill. And Theodore, my son, the boy I'd driven to baseball practice for 8 years, the boy I'd cossened his first apartment lease for, the boy I'd sat up with through fevers and heartbreaks and college finals, Theodore said, in a voice that was completely flat and matter of fact, it's from helping my mother move. It's fine, she's a financial burden, but it's not going to be forever. A financial burden, not my mom needs help, not we supported her during her surgery. A burden, a financial burden. The way you describe a car payment you resent. Jennifer said something I couldn't make out, and Theodore said, she's 70. She can't live on her own much longer anyway. We'll figure it out when we have to. I lay there in my recliner for a long time after that call ended. The soup Clarice had brought was going cold on the side table. The television was on, some cooking show, someone making something cheerful, and the sound of it felt obscene. I called Doris that night. I told her what I'd heard word for word because I had replayed it so many times by then that it was burned in. Doris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Twyla, I need to tell you something I've been sitting on for 6 months, and I wasn't going to say it, but I think you need to know. She told me that she'd run into our old church friend, Beverly Marsh, at a women's luncheon in Columbus the previous fall. Beverly had mentioned that she'd spoken to Jennifer at a neighborhood event, and Jennifer had told her, over plates of chicken salad and sweet tea, that Twyla Roy had really gone downhill since Walter passed, that I was forgetting things constantly, that Theodore was managing her affairs because I wasn't really capable anymore. Capable. I was a woman who had just navigated open-heart surgery, managed my own medical decisions, coordinated my own post-surgical care, and was healing on schedule. I was a woman who balanced her own checkbook, drove herself to every appointment, maintained her own home, and had never, not once, asked Theodore to manage anything on my behalf. But if you tell enough people a story, the story starts to become real. People see what they're primed to see. They ask, how's she doing? With that particular tone, they offer help you didn't request. They lower their expectations for you in ways you can feel but can't quite argue against. I thought about that for a long time. And then I called Theodore. It was a Sunday. I didn't wait for 2 o'clock. I called at 9 in the morning, which I had never done, and when he picked up sounding surprised, I said very calmly, Theodore, I need you to hear me. I know what you said to Jennifer about me. I know what Jennifer has been telling people, and I want you to know that I heard you. There was silence, and then he said, Mom, I think you misunderstood. Not, I'm sorry, not, that's not what I meant, not, I should never have said that. I misunderstood. I want every woman listening to hear that word. Misunderstood. It is one of the most common tools used against women who have been wronged by someone who doesn't want to face it. You heard what you heard. You saw what you saw. You felt what you felt. And suddenly, instead of being acknowledged, you are reframed as someone who didn't understand correctly. It is designed to make you doubt yourself. And for women of our generation who were raised to defer, to smooth things over, to assume the other person probably knows better, it can work. It worked on me for years, but not that day. That day I was sitting with a scar on my chest, the echo of his words still fresh and Doris's voice still in my ear. I knew what I heard. I knew what had been said about me. And I had finally run out of patience for the version of events that required me to be the one who had it wrong. I told him I was going to take some time and space, and that I would reach out when I was ready. He started to speak again, and I told him I loved him because I did, and I always would, and then I hung up. And I did not call him again. That was the spring of 2022. For 4 years, my phone did not ring with Theodore's number. Not on my birthday, not at Christmas. Not when Clarice's husband passed and she called me at midnight crying, and I thought about what it meant that my son didn't even know I was holding my neighbor's hand through grief. Not once until the letter. I want to tell you about those 4 years because they matter. People assume silence is the same as suffering, and in the beginning it was, I won't pretend otherwise. The first Thanksgiving after I stopped contact, I sat at Clarice's table with her daughter and 2 grandchildren, and I was grateful, genuinely grateful, but there was a hollow sound in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgery. I missed him. I missed the Theodore I had raised. I kept mourning that boy even as I accepted that the man he'd become had made choices I couldn't keep absorbing. That's the thing nobody tells you about cutting contact with a child. You're not cutting off the person who hurt you. You're also cutting off every version of them you ever loved. The 7-year-old with the missing front tooth. The teenager who burned the first batch of Christmas cookies and laughed about it. The young man at his college graduation who grabbed my hand and said, I wouldn't have made it without you, Mom. That grief is real, and it took time. But time, when you use it right, does something remarkable. I started walking every morning, just around the block at first, then further. By that fall, I was doing 2 miles before breakfast, down the quiet streets of my neighborhood, past the retirees walking their dogs and the young couple who always waved from their porch. I started a container garden on my back porch. Tomatoes, peppers, basil, 2 kinds of lettuce. By the second summer, I was bringing bags of tomatoes to Clarice and to my new friend Ruth Ann Perkins, who I met at the library's Tuesday book club and who became one of the funniest women I have ever known in my life. Ruth Ann is 68. She's a retired pharmacist from Atlanta who moved to Greenville when her husband got a teaching position at Furman University. She does not take nonsense from anyone, and she makes the best peach cobbler in the state of South Carolina. She became a fixture in my life so fast it surprised me. I also went back to work, not nursing. I was well past that. But the Greenville County Library System was looking for volunteer readers for their senior literacy program. Once a week I sat with adults learning to read for the first time, and I helped them sound out words, and I watched something open up in their faces that I had not expected. Joy, the pure joy of something clicking into place. One of my students was a 72-year-old man named Henry Watts who had spent his whole life hiding that he couldn't read. And the day he read a full page of a book on his own, a page about birds of the Carolinas, that man put the book down and said, "Mrs. Roy, I feel like I got something back that I didn't even know I'd lost." I understood exactly what he meant. I was getting something back too. My sense of my own worth, separate from whether my son called. My ability to sit in a room full of people and feel like I belonged there. My certainty that I still had things to contribute, things to learn, things to enjoy. I turned 70 in October of 2023. Clarice threw a dinner party. Ruth Ann made the peach cobbler. Doris drove down from Dayton. My neighbor on the other side, a retired veterinarian named Dr. Paul Nguyen, brought champagne and made a toast that made us all laugh. My church choir sang happy birthday over speakerphone. It was the best birthday I'd had in years. Theodore did not call. I noticed. I didn't wait. I blew out the candles. I want to be careful here because I know some of you listening to this are in the middle of it, the silence, the waiting, the wondering if you made the right call. So let me tell you what I learned in those 4 years. You do not need the other person to change for you to heal. You do not need an apology to rebuild your life. You do not need the door to open from their side for you to find warmth on yours. The silence was not my punishment. It was my protection, and eventually it became my peace. Let me tell you about Henry Watts one more time because I think about him often. Henry came to the literacy program the way most of my students did, quietly, almost sheepishly, like he was half expecting someone to tell him it was too late. He was 72. He'd spent 50 years in construction. He knew how to build houses, read blueprints, manage crews of 40 men. He had a whole life of competence and dignity. And he had hidden carefully, exhaustingly hidden, the fact that he could not read a grocery list. He told me once in his second month with me, "My whole life I've been afraid someone would find out, and that would be the thing that defined me. The thing that erased everything else I'd done." I told him, "Henry, you learn to adapt, to compensate, to survive, and to succeed in a world that wasn't built for you. That's not a deficit. That's strength you had to build yourself because nobody handed it to you." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Roy, somebody said that to you before, haven't they?" I said, "I'm still learning to believe it." That conversation stayed with me. Because that's what those 4 years were really about. Learning to believe, truly believe, not just say that the person I was when no one was validating me was still a person worth being. I'll tell you something I have never told anyone outside my closest friends. For the first year of the silence, I kept waiting for Theodore to call and apologize. Every time my phone rang, I felt a small spike. Could be him, could be today, could be the call where he says, "I'm sorry, Mom, I was wrong." I was monitoring my own phone like a teenager waiting to hear from a boy who wasn't thinking about her. It took the better part of a year to stop doing that, to stop organizing my emotional life around whether or not someone else was going to show up. The day I stopped, I went to the farmer's market in Greenville by myself, bought a bunch of sunflowers and a jar of local honey, came home and put the sunflowers in a vase on the kitchen table, made a cup of tea, and sat there in my own quiet kitchen and thought. This is enough. This moment is enough. That was the turning point. Not any dramatic event, just a jar of honey and a bunch of sunflowers and the understanding that my life was fully happening whether my son acknowledged it or not. I won't tell you it was easy. I'll tell you it was worth it. And then on a Thursday morning in March 2026, 4 years, 11 months, and 12 days after I last spoke to my son, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Return address, the law offices of Marcus Webb, Columbia, South Carolina. I did not recognize the name. I held that envelope in my kitchen for the better part of 2 days. I'm going to tell you why I waited 2 days to open it. When you've been through what I'd been through, when the people who are supposed to love you most have systematically told the world you aren't capable, aren't reliable, aren't quite right in the head, you develop a habit of bracing. You learn to pause before something hits you, so that when it does, it finds you standing. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter Friday morning, and I looked at it while I made my coffee. I looked at it while I ate my oatmeal. I looked at it when I came back from my walk. I want to explain that delay because it might seem strange to people who haven't been through an estrangement. When you have spent years anticipating calls that don't come, messages that don't arrive, acknowledgments that somehow never materialize, you build a certain armor. A habit of not letting hope rush in before you've had time to prepare for disappointment. An envelope from a law firm addressed specifically to me, after 4 years of absolute silence, could have been many things. It could have been good news. It could have been terrible news. It could have been a trap of a kind I hadn't yet imagined. I had been caught off guard enough times in my life that I'd stopped letting envelopes surprise me. I gave myself 2 full days. I brewed my coffee. I fed the birds. I slept on it twice. And when I finally sat down with it on that Saturday morning, I was ready. Saturday morning, I brought it to the kitchen table. The coffee was fresh. The house was quiet. Clarice was at her daughter's for the weekend. Ruth Ann was at the farmer's market. It was just me and the envelope and the sound of the cardinal that lives in my oak tree. I opened it. Inside was a 2-page letter on heavy paper with the law firm's letterhead at the top. Below the formal greeting, which was addressed to Miss Twyla Elaine Roy, the letter stated the following: that I was being contacted on behalf of my son, Theodore James Roy, in connection with a residential property. That the property was located at 14 Lakeview Ridge Road, Lake Lure, North Carolina. That my late husband, Walter Roy, had established an irrevocable trust in 2016, 3 years before his death, and that this trust named me, Twyla Elaine Roy, as the sole trustee and controlling party. That Theodore Roy had applied to refinance a business loan, and that the lender required a clear title report on all properties connected to any member of the household. That because the Lake Lure property was held in trust with me as trustee, my signature and my authorization was required before any action could be taken on that property. And that Mr. Theodore Roy was requesting, through his attorney Marcus Webb, that I sign a release document transferring trustee control to Theodore Roy, at which point he would be free to use the property as collateral for the loan. I read it 3 times, then I set it down, then I picked it up and read it again. Because here is what I need you to understand. I had no idea that property existed. None. Walter had never mentioned a lake house in Lake Lure. We had never vacationed there together. In all my years of going through his papers after his death, settling his estate with the attorney, closing accounts, filing taxes, not once had this property come up. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in my hands and I thought, Walter, what did you do? I thought about my husband, methodical, quiet, careful Walter, who read every contract twice before signing, who kept a filing cabinet organized by year and category, who said almost nothing but meant everything he said. Walter, who had watched how my son and his wife treated me for years and had never once said a harsh word about either of them to me. Walter, who had simply, quietly, efficiently done something about it. I went to Walter's memory box. I keep it in the closet shelf in the spare bedroom. It's a plain wooden box, medium-sized, that holds the things I couldn't throw away when I settled his estate: letters, cards, a few photographs, his reading glasses, his pocket watch, and an envelope I had found in his desk drawer in the weeks after he passed. That envelope had his handwriting on the front. It said, "For Twyla, open when you need it." I had never opened it. I don't know exactly why. Part of it was grief. I couldn't bear to read his final words to me alone in a quiet house in those first months. Part of it was that I kept thinking I'd wait until I really needed it, until there was a moment that clearly required it. Inside Walter's envelope were 2 things. The first was a folded packet of documents, official-looking, stamped, notarized, legal paper, the heavy kind. At the top of the first page in clean type were the words, Irrevocable Trust Declaration, WALTER James Roy Family Trust. I put on my reading glasses and I read every word of it. Here is what Walter had done. In 2016, 3 years before he died and 2 years before Theodore married Jennifer, Walter had purchased a residential property in Lake Lure, North Carolina. A lake house, 14 Lakeview Ridge Road. He had purchased it in cash, using savings he had accumulated quietly over many years in an account I didn't have access to, not because he was hiding it from me in any harmful way. Because Walter was the kind of man who thought 30 years ahead and liked to have something set aside that no one could touch. He had placed the property immediately into an irrevocable trust. The trust named me, Twyla Elaine Roy, as the sole trustee. The trust named no other beneficiary, not Theodore, not any future spouse of Theodore. The trust was structured so that I had full discretion over the property during my lifetime. I could use it, lease it, gift it, or hold it. The only thing I could not do was sell it and give the proceeds to a third party without independent legal counsel, a provision Walter had specifically included, with a note in the margin that said protection against pressure. I read that line 3 times. Protection against pressure. Walter knew. He knew that someday someone might put pressure on me. He knew that I might be in a position where my own generosity or my love for my son might make me give away something I shouldn't. And so he built a wall around it, a legal wall, solid as concrete, that no one could talk me out of or around. I set the document down and I looked at the second thing in the envelope. It was a single sheet of paper. Notebook paper, the wide-ruled kind. Walter's handwriting, which was always slightly cramped because he'd broken 2 fingers on his right hand in 1978 and they'd healed at an angle. He wrote, Twyla, I bought this house for you, not for us, not for the family, for you. I've watched the way things have been going and I want you to have something that is yours alone, that no one can take, that no one can talk you into giving away. You have given your whole life to other people. This is yours. The attorney is Charles Whitfield in Columbia. His number is on the trust documents. Call him if you ever need to. I love you more than I was ever good at saying. Walter, I sat at the kitchen table with that letter in my hands and I cried. Not sad crying, not grieving crying, the other kind, the kind that loosens something tight that has been wound up for years, the kind that says you were seen. You were loved, someone was paying attention even when you didn't know it. Walter had watched, he had watched the slow erosion. He had watched the way Jennifer looked at me. He had watched Theodore's silences. He had watched my endless accommodations, and he had said nothing to me about it because he was Walter and he didn't speak until he had something solid to offer. What he offered was a house on a lake in North Carolina. I need to take a moment here to tell you about Walter's way of loving because it is relevant and because I think some of you will recognize it. Walter was not a man who said, I love you, easily or often. He said it at our wedding. He said it when Theodore was born. He said it once when I was in the middle of a very bad year at work and I came home crying at the kitchen table and he sat across from me and waited until I was done and then said quietly, Twyla, I love you, tell me what you need. That was it. 3 times in 38 years that I can count on one hand where those words came unprompted, but Walter expressed love through acts so specific and well-considered that they might as well have been love letters. He rotated the tires on my car every 6 months without being asked. When I mentioned once in passing that I'd always wanted to learn to make proper pie crust, he bought me a baking class for Christmas. When I had a difficult patient during my last years of nursing, a terminal case that was breaking my heart, he left a cup of tea outside the bedroom door every morning without comment, just so it would be there when I came out. He didn't make speeches, he paid attention, and then he acted on what he noticed. The lake house was the largest, most elaborate version of that. He watched what was happening to me within my own family. He couldn't stop it. He tried talking to Theodore once directly, and it didn't go well, and Walter was wise enough to know that forcing the issue would only push Theodore further away. But he could make sure that no matter what happened, I would not be left with nothing. He bought that house and he put it in trust and he sealed it in an envelope and he wrote, for Twyla, open when you need it, he knew. He knew there would come a day when I needed it. He just didn't know he would not be here when that day arrived. And now my son was asking me to sign it away. Now here is the part I want you to really sit with, because this is where it gets interesting. That lake house, according to a quick search I did that afternoon on real estate sites, had a current estimated value of $410,000. $410,000, cash. A fully paid, debt-free property on Lake Lure, which if you've never been there is one of the most beautiful lakes in the Carolina mountains. the same lake where Dirty Dancing was filmed, which means nothing to the property value, but I like knowing it. Theodore and Jennifer had been using this house. I need you to hear that clearly. According to what I later learned from my attorney, more on that in a moment, Theodore had discovered the existence of the trust 18 months earlier when he was researching the family estate for his own financial planning. He had found the trust, found the property, and had been using the lake house for the past year and a half. He and Jennifer had taken friends there. They had posted photographs. They had treated it as their own. All while I, the sole trustee, the only person with any legal authority over that property, had no idea it existed. They had never mentioned it to me, not once. Not even a "Hey Mom, did you know Dad bought a lake house?" Nothing, because as long as I didn't know, they could use it freely. The moment I knew, they had to reckon with the fact that I controlled it. And now Theodore's business was in trouble. He needed the property as collateral. He couldn't use it as collateral without my signature. So his attorney had written me a formal letter, cold and transactional, asking me to sign over control of a $410,000 asset that my husband had specifically set up to protect me. I picked up the phone and I called my friend Ruth Ann. "Ruth Ann," I said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." She listened. When I finished, there was a pause. And then Ruth Ann said, "Twyla, you call Charles Whitfield right now and then you call me back." Charles Whitfield, Walter's attorney, answered on the second ring. He had been expecting my call for years, he said. He had Walter's instructions in the file. He walked me through everything calmly and clearly. The trust was valid, active, and fully legally binding. Theodore had no claim on it, no rights to it. No power to act on it without my express written consent. The request in the lawyer's letter was, as Whitfield put it, optimistic at best. "What would you like to do, Mrs. Roy?" he asked. "I'd like to go to that meeting," I said. "But not to sign anything." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Would you like me to prepare a response letter and perhaps accompany you? I'd like you to prepare certified copies of everything," I said. "And I'd like you to recommend a family law attorney, someone sharp." He gave me a name immediately. "Diane Hartwell, JD," he said. "She's the best in Greenville and she doesn't waste words." I said, "Perfect." "Neither do I." I called Marcus Webb's office that afternoon and told the receptionist I'd be attending the meeting. Thursday, 10 o'clock. She said Theodore would be present. I said that was fine. Then I went to my kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on the back porch and watched the birds at my feeder for a long time. Walter, 30 years of quiet love and careful planning, and even from the other side, he was still the most organized man I'd ever known. I want to tell you what I wore. I know that sounds like a small thing, but it isn't. Not when you're walking back into a room with a person who told the world you were senile. Not when you're sitting across a table from a son who called you a financial burden. What you wear is armor, and I chose mine carefully. I wore my navy wool blazer, the one I bought for Walter's funeral, the one that still fits perfectly because I walk 2 miles every morning. I wore a white blouse and my pearl earrings, which were my mother Rosalie's. I carried a leather bag that Walter gave me for our 30th anniversary. Inside that bag, a folder with certified copies of every document Charles Whitfield had prepared, Walter's handwritten letter in a clear protective sleeve, Diane Hartwell's business card, and my reading glasses. Diane met me in the parking garage. She was smaller than I expected, barely 5'3", silver bob, reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of direct handshake that tells you immediately she is not in the business of softening things. "I've looked over everything," she said. "The trust is bulletproof. Your husband was thorough. He was an engineer," I said. She almost smiled. "That explains it." We took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Marcus Webb's office was the kind of place that tries to look impressive without quite pulling it off. Leather chairs that were a little too stiff. A bookshelf with law books arranged by color rather than subject. A large desk behind which sat a man in his mid-40s with a tie that had a subtle plaid and the air of someone who expected this to be a short meeting. Theodore was already there. He was seated to the right of Webb's desk in one of the stiff leather chairs. He looked older. His hair had more gray in it than I remembered. He was wearing a button-down shirt and the good watch Jennifer had given him for his 40th birthday. He looked up when I walked in. I looked back at him. We hadn't been in the same room for 4 years, 11 months, and 15 days. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because I've turned it over many times since. I felt nothing dramatic, no rush of anger, no surge of grief. What I felt was something steadier and stranger, clarity. The particular clarity you get when you've sat with something long enough that it no longer has power to catch you off guard. I nodded to him, he nodded back. Jennifer, I noted, was not there. Webb stood and offered his hand. Mrs. Roy, thank you for coming. I understand you have some questions about the document before you sign. I'm not signing anything today, I said pleasantly. I took a seat beside Diane and set my bag on the table. I'm here to have a conversation. Webb looked at Diane. And you are? Diane Hartwell. I represent Mrs. Roy. She set her own card on the desk. We can begin whenever you're ready. Webb looked at Theodore. Theodore looked at his hands. Mrs. Roy, Webb said, recalibrating, as I'm sure you've reviewed, this is a straightforward request. Your son simply needs your authorization as trustee to use the Lake Lure property as collateral on an existing loan. It won't affect your rights, and Mr. Webb, I said, I'd like to ask my son a question if that's all right. A pause. Of course, I looked at Theodore. Theodore, I said, when did you find out about the lake house? A beat. A while back. How long is a while? He shifted. About 18 months ago, maybe longer. And you've been using it. He looked at the table. Jennifer and I have stayed there a few times. A few times, I said. I've seen the photographs, Theodore. You were there for 4th of July. You were there at Thanksgiving. You had people over, friends, a group of them on the dock. Silence. Did you consider calling me, not to ask permission, just to say, Mom, did you know? Dad left a lake house. More silence. Webb looked like a man who wanted to intervene but couldn't find the right opening. You didn't call, I said. Not about the house, not about my birthday, not about my surgery, not in 4 years, but when you needed my signature on a document that would give you control of a $410,000 asset, your attorney found me within the week. Theodore's jaw tightened. Mom, I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. I'm stating facts. Those are the facts. Diane opened the folder and set a certified copy of the trust on Webb's desk with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this many times. This is the full trust declaration, filed in 2016, county-stamped, notarized, fully active, she said. Mrs. Roy is the sole trustee. Under the terms of the trust, she has full discretion over the property during her lifetime. There is no provision requiring her to co-sign, release, or encumber this property for any beneficiary. In fact, she turned a page. There is an explicit protective clause requiring independent legal counsel for any transfer. That's us. Webb looked at the document. He looked at it for longer than a man would look at something that didn't concern him. The request in your letter, Diane continued, asks Mrs. Roy to transfer trustee authority to her son. That would effectively end the trust protections entirely. Mrs. Roy's answer to that request is no. Theodore looked up. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected. Mom, I'm in real trouble here. I waited. The business, he stopped. Ran a hand over his face. We expanded too fast. We took on debt we thought we could cover. The bank needs additional collateral or they call the loan. If they call the loan, he stopped again. How much? I said. He named a number. It was significant. It was the kind of number that explains why a man sends a lawyer's letter to his mother after almost 5 years of silence. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened my bag and I took out Walter's letter in its protective sleeve. I set it on the table between us. Your father wrote this before he died, I said. He left it for me. I opened it 2 days ago, the night after this arrived. I touched the corner of Webb's letter. I'd like you to read it. Theodore picked it up. He read it. I watched his face. I've replayed that moment in my mind many times. His father's handwriting, his father's cramped, deliberate letters, his father's voice in a room where his father had been absent for 6 years. When Theodore set it down, his eyes were wet. He knew, Theodore said. It wasn't a question. He knew, I said. We sat in Marcus Webb's conference room in silence for a long time. Webb was looking at his desk. Diane was looking at her folder. Theodore and I were looking at each other. What are you going to do? He asked finally. I'm going to honor what your father intended, I said. The house stays in trust. Mom, but I want to tell you something first. I folded my hands on the table. I heard the phone call, the one you made to Jennifer. I heard what you said about me. The color left his face. I know what Jennifer has been telling people about my memory, about my capability, about being difficult and unstable. I kept my voice even. I want you to know that I know. And I want you to know that it didn't break me. I am not the woman that story describes. I never was. Your father knew that, and somewhere in you, I believe you know it too. Theodore said nothing. But his eyes told me something I hadn't been sure of, that he was ashamed. Genuinely ashamed, not embarrassed about being caught, ashamed. That was the moment I laughed, not because it was funny. Because something released in me that I hadn't known I was still holding. Because 4 years of carrying this, the surgery, the phone call, the rumors, the silence, all of it compressed into this one ridiculous moment where my son's attorney had sent me a letter asking me to hand over the very thing my late husband had put in place to protect me from exactly this situation. The irony of it, the absolute, complete, almost elegant irony. I laughed the way you laugh when a story is so complete it couldn't have been written better. Webb looked at me with genuine alarm. Mrs. Roy, are you all right? Mr. Webb, I said when I could speak again, I am better than I have been in years. I stood. Diane stood with me. Theodore, I said, I love you. I have always loved you. That has not changed and it will not change. But I will not sign this document. And if you want to find a way back to something real between us, not financial, not transactional, something real, you know where I live. I picked up my bag. Take care of yourself, I said. And I walked out. The drive to Lake Lure is about an hour and 45 minutes from Greenville, going northeast through the foothills and up into the mountains. I went 3 weeks after the meeting. On a Saturday morning in April, with Clarice in the passenger seat and a thermos of coffee and the windows cracked so we could smell the pines coming in, Clarice had never been to Lake Lure. She kept saying, "Oh, Twyla," every few miles when the mountains got greener and the road got narrower and the views opened up between the trees. I had a key. Charles Whitfield had mailed it to me the week after the meeting, along with a brief note confirming the trust remained fully intact and that the property taxes were current and the utilities had been kept on. 14 Lakeview Ridge Road is a white wood frame house with a green metal roof, a deep front porch that wraps around one side, and a stone path down to a private dock on the water. There are 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a wood-burning fireplace, a kitchen with windows on 2 sides, and a screen porch off the back that looks directly at the lake. When we pulled into the gravel drive and I saw it for the first time, I sat in the car for a moment. Walter had stood here. He had chosen this. He had stood on that porch and looked at that water and thought, this is for Twyla. My eyes were full before I even got out of the car. Clarice put her hand on mine. She didn't say anything. That is one of the things I love most about Clarice Boudreau. We walked the property together. The dock needed one board replaced. The screen porch had a small tear in the mesh at the corner. The kitchen faucet was loose. Nothing that couldn't be fixed on a weekend. In the master bedroom closet, on the shelf above the clothes rod, was a box. Inside the box, a photograph, a fishing rod, and a folded Green Bay Packers sweatshirt that I immediately recognized because Walter had worn it for 15 years until the elbows went through. The photograph was of us, 1989. We were maybe in our mid-30s. We were standing on a dock, not this dock, somewhere else, I don't even remember where, and Walter had his arm around me, and we were both squinting into the sun and laughing at something. My hair was different, Walter was younger, but his arm was around me the exact same way it always was. I sat down on the edge of the bed with that photograph and I talked to him, not out loud, but I talked to him, I thanked him. I told him I understood. I told him I wished he were here, not to fix anything, just to sit on that screen porch and watch the water with me. Then I put the photograph in my bag, put on the Packers sweatshirt, and went to make Clarice and me a cup of coffee in the kitchen where the windows look out at the lake. Now let me tell you what happened after. Theodore's business situation was serious. Without the lake house as collateral, his options narrowed. He worked something out, I don't know the details, and it isn't my business to know. He took a financial hit, but he didn't lose everything. I know this because 3 weeks after the meeting, I received a letter, a handwritten letter, not from an attorney. From Theodore, he wrote, "Mom, I don't know how to start this. I've started it 4 times. I don't want to write a letter that sounds like I'm apologizing because you have something I need. I know how that looks. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. I'm writing because Dad's letter, reading his handwriting, seeing what he did for you, understanding what that meant, it showed me something I've been avoiding looking at for a long time. I listened to someone else's version of you for so many years that I stopped seeing you clearly. I'm sorry, that's not enough and I know it's not enough. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm just asking you to know that I see it now. I love you, Mom, Theodore." I read that letter at the kitchen table in Lake Lure with my morning coffee. I read it twice. Then I set it down and looked out at the water for a long time. I have not responded yet. Not because I don't intend to, but because some things deserve to be answered slowly and carefully, and I want to be sure that what I say is true when I say it. I called Doris that night. She listened like she always does. Then she said, "What does your gut tell you?" "That the door isn't closed," I said, "but it's not wide open either." "That sounds about right," said Doris. The extended family, for the most part, eventually found out what happened. Small truths have a way of spreading in the same channels that small lies do. Theodore's business troubles were not a secret. The existence of the trust, once it came up in legal proceedings, became a matter of record. Theodore's friend Marcus, the one who had warned me at the Kroger, called me. He said, "I always knew you were okay. I'm glad you're okay." Theodore's aunt on his father's side, Walter's younger sister, Bet, who I have always liked, sent me a card. Inside she wrote, "Walter always was the smartest person in the room. He just never made you feel it. That's the rarest kind of smart." I put that card on my refrigerator. Jennifer has not reached out. I don't expect her to. I hold no particular anger toward Jennifer. Anger takes energy I'd rather spend on my garden, my book club, my walks, my library students. What Jennifer did came from her own fears and insecurities, and those are hers to carry. Not mine. I went back to Lake Lure the following weekend. Ruth Ann came with me this time. She declared the kitchen perfectly functional but deeply in need of a Dutch oven, and we drove to the hardware store in Chimney Rock, and she bought me one as a housewarming gift. We made soup. We sat on the screen porch. The lake was flat and silver in the late afternoon light. A pair of ducks crossed the cove in an unhurried line. Ruth Ann said, "Twyla, I think your husband was something else." And I said, "He really was. I plan to keep the house. I plan to use it. I might rent it out in the summers and use the income for a trip, maybe out west, maybe the Pacific coast, which Walter always wanted to see, and we kept saying there was time. There is time." That's what I keep discovering. Contrary to what the world will sometimes tell women of our age, there is still time. There are still good mornings and good friendships and decisions that belong entirely to you. There are still seasons to plant and seasons to harvest and long drives through mountain roads with the windows down. I want to tell you about something my mother used to say. My mother, Rosalie, grew up very poor in rural Tennessee, one of 7 children, and she had more wisdom in her than she ever got credit for. She used to say, "Twyla, the people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. They show you exactly who they are, and they make you prove to yourself exactly who you are. Let them keep underestimating you. Just make sure you never underestimate yourself." I didn't fully understand that when she said it. I do now, because here is what I have learned at 71 years old, from a surgery that reminded me how fragile the body is, from 4 years of silence that taught me how strong the spirit can be, and from a lawyer's letter that arrived like a setup for the punchline my husband had been holding for 6 years. Your worth is not determined by who shows up at your surgery. Your worth is not determined by whether your son calls on your birthday. Your worth is not determined by whether the people who were supposed to love you most actually did. Your worth is something you carry with you, something that no one can deed away, no trust can dissolve, and no estranged son's attorney can ask you to sign over. It is yours. It always has been. And the sooner we stop waiting for someone else to notarize it, the sooner we can actually use it. I think about the women who are going to hear this story. I think about the 68-year-old who is lying awake tonight wondering if she was wrong to set that limit, wrong to stop accepting less than she deserved, wrong to choose herself. I think about the 73-year-old whose daughter-in-law has been quietly, methodically writing her out of her grandchildren's lives. I think about the 66-year-old who went through something medical and frightening alone because the people she had expected to be there weren't. I want to speak directly to each of you. You were not wrong. You were not wrong to need. You were not wrong to expect. You were not wrong to grieve when those expectations went unmet. And you are not wrong to protect yourself now, whatever that protection looks like. Some of you are still in the middle of it. Some of you haven't made the decision yet. Some of you are afraid that if you draw a clear line, you'll lose the relationship entirely, and that losing it will confirm some quiet fear that you were never loved in the first place. Here is what I wish someone had told me earlier. The relationship you are afraid of losing is already not the relationship you think it is. You are holding on to the idea of it, the version that existed or should have existed. And that version, as much as it hurts to hear this, cannot be preserved by you continuing to absorb the harm. It can only be rebuilt, if it can be rebuilt at all, when both people are honest about what happened. Theodore's letter was the beginning of that honesty. I don't know where it leads. I don't know if we can rebuild something real, but the honesty is real, and that is more than I had 4 years ago. Diane Hartwell called me the day after the meeting just to check in. I told her I was fine, and she said, in that direct way she has, "You were the best client I've had in years. You knew exactly what you wanted and you didn't waver." I thanked her. She said, "Your husband sounds like he was extraordinary." And I said, yes, he was. The ordinary kind of extraordinary, the kind that shows up every day without fanfare and does what it does quietly and completely. Charles Whitfield, Walter's attorney, sent a brief note as well. It read only, "The trust is secure. Please call if you have any questions. It has been an honor to carry out Walter's instructions." I put that note in Walter's memory box. Here is something practical I want to share. because this channel is about real women and real life, and sometimes real life requires practical knowledge. What my husband did setting up an irrevocable trust is something any of us can do. It is not just for wealthy people. It is not complicated. It is a legal document drafted by an attorney that places an asset in a protected structure and designates who controls it and who benefits from it. It cannot be challenged easily by outside parties. It protects what you have worked for. If you have assets, a house, savings, a piece of property, and you have family dynamics that concern you, I strongly encourage you to speak to an estate attorney. Not because you expect the worst, but because you deserve to know that your wishes will be honored when you are no longer in a position to defend them. Walter did that for me. He did it quietly and he did it early. And because of it, I sat in a lawyer's office 30 years later and laughed instead of cried. That is the kind of practical love that lasts. I drove up to Lake Lure again last weekend, by myself this time. I made coffee, sat on the screen porch, watched the light change on the water for 2 hours. I found Walter's old wood-handled fishing rod in the shed, and I walked down to the dock and I cast a line and I caught absolutely nothing. It was one of the best mornings of my life. There are still people who will see you clearly, who have always seen you clearly, and it turns out that some of them set things in motion years before you knew you'd need them. I think about Walter often. I think about what he saw and said nothing about and chose instead to act. I think about the patience it took. I think about the love it took, the steady, unshowy, engineered kind of love that doesn't announce itself, it just shows up in the paperwork. I want to say something to anyone listening to this who is where I was 4 years ago. If you are the woman who has been called too much, too needy, too difficult, too old. If someone has told the people around you that you aren't capable, aren't reliable, aren't quite right anymore. If you've been managed out of your own family, the way a budget line gets trimmed, quietly, without ceremony, with the expectation that you won't push back. Listen to me, you are not who they say you are. You are not a burden. You are not unstable. You are not past your usefulness or your worth or your right to be treated with dignity. You are a woman who has been here a long time, who has seen things and survived things and built things, who has loved people who didn't always love you back in kind and done it anyway because that is who you are. And here is what I know to be true. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. Walk your 2 miles, tend your garden, show up to your book club and laugh too loud at Ruth Ann's jokes. Answer the phone calls from Doris and Clarice and the people who have earned the right to your time. And when the envelope arrives from the attorney's office, when the moment comes that requires you to know who you are and what you are owed, you will be ready. Because you didn't spend those quiet years waiting, you spent them becoming. My name is Twila Roy. I am 71 years old. I am a retired nurse and a morning walker and a tomato grower and a terrible but enthusiastic fisherwoman. I am the sole trustee of the Walter James Roy Family Trust, which holds a beautiful lake house in the Carolina mountains that my husband bought for me without telling me, because he loved me in the most practical and profound way a person can love someone. My son sent his attorney to find me after almost 5 years of silence. What his attorney found was a woman who had spent those years becoming exactly who she needed to be. And I sat in that conference room and I read one piece of paper and I laughed, because Walter Roy had been looking out for me all along. And some things, the right things, the true things, are simply worth laughing about. If you stayed all the way to the end of this story, thank you. I mean that. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there. And if this story hit close to home, if you've ever been called too much or not enough or been quietly erased from a table you helped build, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. This channel is for real women, real boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to protect what matters. If that's you, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.